The fuel line was leaking again. Darian Cole pressed his back flat against the underside of the cargo loader. Flashlight clenched between his teeth, both hands working in a space barely wide enough for one. The smell of burnt coolant was so familiar to him by now that he barely noticed it. 7 years on Caro 9 had a way of doing that. It took the edges off things, smells, sounds, the sight of creatures that would have made a younger version of him stop and stare. All of it had become background, just the station, just the work. He found the crack, sealed it with bonding compound, and held it with his thumb for a count of 30. The loader above him ticked and groaned. Somewhere deeper in the docking bay, 2 Thule cargo workers were arguing about weight distribution in a language that sounded like someone dropping cutlery down a staircase. A station announcement played in 4 languages, none of them requiring his attention. He slid out from under the machine, sat up on the floor, and checked his work from the outside. Clean seal. He made a note on his work pad and stood. Caro 9 was not a beautiful station. Nobody had ever called it that. It was a junction point, a place ships stopped at because they had to, for fuel, for repairs, for the kind of maintenance that deep space made unavoidable. The corridors were narrow, and the air recyclers were loud, and the lighting in the lower bays had been the same yellowish dim for as long as anyone could remember, but it worked. Everything on Caro 9 worked, and that was largely because of people like Darian, who cared about function more than appearance and had never once filed a complaint about the lighting. He was gathering his tools when the station's long-range detection system chimed, not the soft chime of a scheduled arrival, but the double pulse that meant unplanned approach. He glanced up at the bay's overhead display. A vessel was coming in on the far docking corridor. Designation, Vreth. Registry, Ashkin Covenant. Approach status, emergency. He watched the data scroll for a moment. Hull integrity at 61%. Portside thruster offline, secondary power fluctuating. He picked up his tool bag and was already walking before the repair assignment hit his pad. He had worked on Vreth ships before. They were built differently from most. Heavier, denser, made for heat tolerance because the Vreth themselves ran hot. Their hulls used a layered composite that took specialized tools and a certain patience to work with. Darian had both. He had requested the Vreth repair certifications 3 years ago, not because it was required of him, but because an uncertified job was a bad job, and bad jobs were the one thing he genuinely could not stand. The Ashkin Covenant came in through the wide cargo doors of Bay 7. It was immediately clear that something had gone very wrong on that ship. The starboard side was not just damaged, it was torn, a section of hull plating roughly the size of a transport shuttle had peeled back like foil. The edges blackened, the inner structure exposed and still faintly glowing with residual heat. Emergency sealant foam had been applied from the inside. Pale and hardened in uneven clumps across the breach, someone had worked fast to keep the ship airtight. They had succeeded barely. The ship settled into the docking clamps with a heavy shudder around Darian. The usual activity of the bay slowed and then quietly rearranged itself. The Thule workers drifted back toward the far wall. The Orvani fueling crew found reasons to be elsewhere, even the 2 station security officers near the main entrance took a few steps sideways. None of them said anything. They didn't have to. The Vreth had that effect. The boarding ramp descended with a hiss, and the first one came out, a female. Tall, her scales the color of deep rust, her posture straight despite the obvious exhaustion in her eyes. She wore the markings of a ship's first mate. Behind her came more of the crew, 6, 8, 10 of them, moving with the quiet efficiency of people who had just survived something and were not finished. dealing with it yet. Darien walked toward the ramp. He was aware of the space that opened up around him as he did the invisible gap that everyone else was maintaining between themselves and the Vreth crew. He didn't think much of it. He had a job to do, and the job was standing right in front of him in the form of a badly damaged ship that needed to be assessed. Before anything else happened, the first mate, her name he would learn later, was Vayek, noticed him. Approaching, her eyes tracked him the way all Vreth eyes tracked things. Completely, without blinking, with a patience that some species found unsettling, he met her gaze and nodded once. "Hull team," he said, holding up his work pad so she could see the repair. "Assignment, I need to walk the exterior damage before we start patching. That breach on the starboard side, can you tell me if the inner bulkhead is holding?" She studied him for a moment. There was something in her expression he couldn't quite name, not suspicion exactly, more like recalibration. Like she had expected a different kind of greeting and was adjusting. "The inner bulkhead is intact," she said. "The breach occurred during an internal pressure event. The cause is," she paused just briefly, "still being contained." He nodded and went to look at the hull. He was on his second pass of the exterior damage, measuring stress fractures along the plating edge when the sound came, deep in the ship, below the engine deck. From the sound of it, a shriek that didn't belong to any mechanical failure he had ever heard, too organic, too sharp, too alive. And then another. And then a third. Vayek was at the top of the ramp when it happened. Darien saw her stop. He saw every Vreth on the docking floor stop. Whatever that sound was, it reached them differently than it reached him. It reached them in the blood. Elder Drawsk appeared at the top of the ramp. Darien had not seen him come out. He was old, the elder, older than any Vreth Darien had encountered on the station, and the scales around his face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with age. He looked down at Vayek. He said one word. Darien was close enough to hear it. "Hatchlings." For 2 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the alarms started. The alarms did not sound like emergencies usually sounded on Caro 9. Usually it was a steady pulse, measured, calm, the kind of sound designed to move people without panicking them. Station protocol, Brel had insisted on it years ago when she took command, and the crew had gotten used to it. Alarms meant pay attention. Alarms meant something needs doing. This alarm was different. It was the triple burst, the one that the station manual described simply as full withdrawal, not please clear the area. Not non-essential personnel stand by. Full withdrawal meant everybody not actively required for containment was to remove itself from Bay 7 immediately and seal the access corridor behind them. Darien had heard that alarm exactly once before, and that had been a drill. He stood near the base of the Ashkin Covenant's hull, tool bag in hand, and watched Bay 7 begin to empty with a speed that he had never seen the bay achieve for any other reason. The Thule workers went first, were already near the far exit, and they went through it fast without looking back. The Orvani fueling crew disconnected their lines mid-cycle and moved in that rapid six-limbed scramble that only happened when an Orvani was genuinely afraid. The 2 security officers paused only long enough to wave urgently at anyone still visible before they, too, passed through the blast corridor and out. The Vreth crew on the docking floor moved back up the ramp, not in retreat. They were deliberate about it, organized, the way trained people move when they know the procedure and are following it, even though following it means leaving something behind. Elder Drawsk was the last one up the ramp. He stopped at the top of it and looked back down at the bay. Then he looked at Darien, still standing near the hull. Something passed across the old Vreth's face. It was not an expression. Darien had a name for. He had been around enough species to know that. Expressions didn't always translate, and he didn't try to read this one. The ramp retracted. The ship sealed itself from the inside. The blast door at the main bay entrance began to close. Darien's comm crackled. Cole. It was Commander Brell, her voice tight. In the specific way it got when she was managing several things at once and none of them were going well. You need to be through that door right now. What got out? He asked. A pause, short but there. 4 hatchlings, feral window. They were in a sealed containment unit in the lower hold, and the pressure event damaged. The locks. Cole, I need you moving. He looked at the blast door. It was more than halfway closed. He looked at the bay. The bay was big, one of the largest on the station, 5 docked ships. Cargo pallets stacked in rows, fuel conduit lines running along the ceiling. A lot of shadows, a lot of places for something small and fast to disappear. Into he couldn't see anything moving. He couldn't hear anything either. Over the fadding alarm, but that didn't mean much. How bad is the feral window? He asked. Dr. Sona Rail's voice came in over Brell's comm line. She had patched herself in, which meant she had been listening, which meant she had already been thinking about this. Bad enough, she said. Vreth hatchlings in the feral window are not what they are after bonding. They're instinctive, heat breaths. Glands are already functional at hatch. Claws are full grown. They don't have language yet, no recognition of rank or authority, not even Vreth authority. That's why the crew had to pull back. An adult Vreth triggers aggression in an unbonded hatchling. It's hardwired. What about humans? Unknown, Rail said. There's almost no recorded interaction between humans and Vreth young in the feral window. We are not part of their instinctive framework. That could go either way. The blast door stopped. It had not sealed. It was sitting at about a quarter open, enough for a person to pass through sideways. The hydraulics hummed, waiting. Cole, Brell said again. He had already turned away from the door. He was looking at the gap between 2 cargo pallets near the middle of the bay. There was something there. He couldn't see it clearly from this distance, but there was a shape in the shadow that did not match the shape of cargo. It was lower than the pallets. It was not moving, and at the base of the shadow, where the overhead light caught the floor, there was a dark streak, slow spreading, thin blood. One of them is injured, he said. Darien, Rail's voice had changed register. That makes it more dangerous. A hurt hatchling is not going to behave predictably. Neither does anything else that's hurt, he said. He heard Brell exhale, the long, controlled kind that meant she was making a decision she didn't want to make. I cannot authorize you to stay in there. She said, I want that on record. Noted, he said. He set down his work pad near the base of the hull, not his tool bag that he kept because the strap gave his hands something to do, and he walked toward the center of the bay. Behind him, after a moment, the blast door finished closing. It sealed with a sound like a held breath finally released. He was alone in the bay now, alone except for 4 feral alien hatchlings that had never seen a human before and had no particular reason to let him stay alive. The lights above him hummed. The shadows between the cargo pallets were very still. Somewhere to his left, near the fuel conduit line, something moved, just the edge of it, just a tail disappearing behind a landing strut. Dark-scaled, quick, smaller than he had expected, but that didn't mean much. Size was not the variable that mattered here. He slowed down, then he slowed down more. He let his shoulders drop. He bent his knees just slightly. He thought about his uncle's voice, old and unhurried, saying the same thing he had said 100 times in 100 different situations. don't perform calm. Just find it, there's a difference, and they always know. The shape behind the cargo pallets had not moved. He changed his direction, not toward it directly, but at an angle the way you approach something when you don't want it to feel cornered. Slower. Lower, talking now under his breath, just sounds, just the presence of a voice that was not raised and not afraid, nothing the hatchlings would understand. It didn't matter, understanding was not the point. He crossed half the bay. Then from the observation window above, thick, reinforced, lined with the shapes of every crew member who had evacuated, he heard nothing. Because the glass was sealed tight, but if he had been able to hear them, he would have heard silence there too, the same kind of silence he was standing in, the held breath kind. He kept walking. He was 10 meters from the injured shape in the shadow when one of the other hatchlings dropped from the top of a cargo pallet directly in front of him. It landed without a sound. It was roughly knee-height, maybe a little more. Dark rust-colored scales like Vayek's, but brighter, newer. Its eyes were amber and very wide, and they were fixed entirely on him with an attention so complete it felt like pressure. Darian stopped. He did not step back. The hatchling's head tilted slowly to one side. They looked at each other. The hatchling in front of him was not what he had imagined. He wasn't sure what he had imagined exactly, something more monstrous. Maybe something that looked like a threat in the way large predators usually looked like threats, all teeth and posture and size, but this creature was small enough that he could have lifted it with both arms, and it was standing in the middle of the docking bay floor, staring at him with its head tilted sideways like it was trying to solve a problem it had never encountered before. Which Darian supposed was exactly what was happening. He stayed where he was. He kept his body language as simple as he could make. Its shoulders relaxed, weight even, nothing pulled tight. The key, his uncle had always said, was not stillness for its own sake. Animals read tension, not movement. You could stand completely still and radiate threat, and they would feel every bit of it. The goal was not to freeze. The goal was to actually not be a threat, and to mean it from the inside out. Darian was good at meaning things. The hatchling's nostrils, a narrow slit on each side of its flat, angular snout, flared once, then again. It was smelling him, cataloging him, trying to fit him into some framework it had been born with, and finding that he didn't slot neatly into any of the categories. He spoke, not words, or rather, words that weren't aimed at communication. Just a low, even sound, the kind of thing you might say to yourself while you were working through a problem. There you go, yeah, just working it out. Take your time. The cadence was the point, steady, unhurried, present. The hatchling's head tilted the other way. From the observation window above, Darian could feel the weight of watching. Even though he couldn't hear anyone up there, he had counted at least 20 shapes pressed against the glass before he stopped looking. He didn't look. Now looking up would change his posture. His eyes stayed on the hatchling in front of him. After a while, he didn't know how long, he had stopped tracking time. The hatchling took one step forward. He didn't move. It took another. Now it was close enough that he could see the texture of its scales clearly. Overlapping, small, each one edged in a slightly lighter shade, like armor that had been made by someone who also cared about the look of it. Its front limbs were tucked close to its body. Its tail moved behind it in a slow, continuous sweep, not aggressive, more like balance. It stretched its neck out and pressed its snout against his left hand. The contact lasted less than 2 seconds. Then it pulled back and made a sound. Low in its throat, not a growl, not exactly, more like a vibration that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. Then it turned and walked away. back toward the cargo pallets, and disappeared. Darian breathed. He had not realized he had been holding his breath. He released it slowly, and took another, and felt his pulse in his ears. He gave himself exactly 10 seconds to be quietly glad that had gone the way it went. Then he started moving again, toward the shadow, toward the injured one. He angled his approach carefully, giving a wide berth to the fuel conduit, where he could see a second hatchling draped across the top, watching him. From above, very still, the way cats watched things from high places, he acknowledged it the way he acknowledged all of them. A glance, a small nod. Nothing more. Then his eyes went back to the path ahead. The blood trail was clearer now, more of it than he'd seen from the door. It was dark, darker than human blood, and it had spread in an irregular shape beneath the cargo pallet where the shape was hiding. He slowed to almost nothing, 3 steps, 2, 1. He crouched down. The hatchling was pressed into the corner, formed by the base of the pallet and the station wall. It was smaller than the one that had approached him. Younger feeling, somehow, though he had no real basis for that. Its scales were a lighter color, almost amber in places, and several of them along its left flank were cracked and dark with dried heat from the explosion. He guessed the wound beneath was not visible from this angle, but the blood told him roughly where it was. It was looking at him. Its eyes were the same amber as its lighter scales, and they were exhausted. In the way injured things' eyes were exhausted, not dim, not glazed, but carrying the weight of pain that hadn't stopped. It did not hiss, it did not move, it just looked at him with those tired amber eyes and waited to see what he would do. He sat down on the floor, not crouching, sitting fully down, cross-legged, making himself shorter than it was, smaller than it was, as unthreatening as a grown man with a tool bag could possibly make himself on the floor of a docking bay. He put the tool bag down beside him. He rested his hands on his knees. He waited. In his ear, Dr. Rail's voice came barely above a whisper, careful with its volume. "You're beside it," she said, not a question. "Yeah," he said, just as quietly. "Is it responding aggressively?" "No." A pause, then, "Darian, I can see a wound on its left side from the observation feed. The camera angle isn't great, but it looks deep." Breaths. Hatchlings have a secondary blood flow system. It is what keeps them functional after injury, but it also means they bleed longer. There's a pressure point, if you can reach it. "Tell me where," he said. She told him, below the left foreleg, at the join where the limb met the body, there was a nerve cluster that also served as a pressure point for the secondary circulatory route. 2 fingers, firm pressure held steady. It wouldn't close the wound, but it would slow what was happening underneath. He looked at the hatchling. It was still looking at him. He didn't move toward it yet. He sat for another long stretch of time and just let himself be there, present, calm, not performing it, actually finding it the way his uncle meant. The hatchling's breathing was visible now that he was close enough, a slow rise and fall of the chest, slightly irregular. It was in pain, and it was tired, and it was a long way from wherever home was supposed to be. He thought about that. He thought about a lot of things in those quiet minutes on the docking bay floor while the rest of the station watched through thick glass and said nothing, and the hatchling in front of him decided slowly what he was. Above him on the fuel conduit, the second hatchling had shifted. He could see it in his peripheral vision. It had turned to face him now, rather than watching from the side. From somewhere between the ships, he could sense the presence of the others, not close, but attentive. They were all watching. Not with aggression, with something else, something that did not have a name in any human language he knew, but that felt, if he were pressed to Describe it like waiting to be shown something. He reached out his hand, palm up, and set it on the floor between himself and the injured hatchling, an offering of nothing, just a hand, just the shape of something that was not a fist and not a claw and was simply there, open in the space between them. The hatchling looked at it for a long time. Then it moved just slightly, just one slow shift of weight so that its head was no longer angled away from him, so that it was, in the most minimal sense possible, facing him. That was all, that was everything. Up at the observation window, Elder Drawsk had not moved from the glass. In a very long time, he stood with his hands at his sides and he watched. The human sitting on the floor in the shadow of a cargo pallet, and his jaw was set in the way of someone who was holding something very carefully. Behind their face, Vayek stood beside him. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. Time in a docking bay has a strange quality when nothing is moving. There were no ships being fueled, no cargo being shifted, no announcements. No argument in a clatter language, no hiss of machinery cycling through its routines, just the low electrical hum that every station made whether anyone was listening or not, and the breathing of a hurt creature in the dark, and a man sitting on the floor beside it. Darian had stopped tracking the minutes. He knew, in a general way, that it had been a while. His legs had started to complain about the position. Somewhere around the 20-minute mark, and he had shifted, slowly, carefully, into something more sustainable, one knee up, one leg extended, back against the cargo pallet. The injured hatchling had watched him make that adjustment with complete attention, and when he was done and still and quiet again, it had made that low throat vibration sound once and then gone back to looking at him. He took that as a good sign. His hand was still on the floor between them. He had not moved it. He wasn't sure if that was still meaningful or if it had just become part of the furniture of the situation, but he left it there anyway. At some point, he became aware that one of the other hatchlings was closer than it had been. He noticed it the way you noticed a change in light. Gradually, and then all at once, it was the one that had smelled his hand. Earlier, it was standing about 3 meters back, not creeping exactly, but not being loud about its approach either. When he looked at it directly, it stopped moving. He looked away. A minute later it was 2.5 meters. Then 2, then it was close enough that he could have reached sideways and touched it. He didn't. He reached into his vest instead. He did it slowly, the way he did everything now, signaling the motion. Before it happened, no sudden grabs, no surprises. His hand found what it was looking for and brought it out into the light. A nutrition bar, dense and brown and wrapped in the plain foil that the station commissary used for everything. He had put it in his vest pocket that morning and forgotten it in the way he forgot food when there was work to do. He broke off a piece. The sound of the foil was extraordinarily loud in the silence. Both hatchlings reacted. The one beside him tensed. The one behind him went still. He held the piece of broken bar in his open palm and set it on the floor in the space between himself and the injured one. Then he set the rest of the bar on his knee and waited. The injured hatchling sniffed the air in the direction of it. Then it did nothing. The nutrition bar was not something it had a category for, and it had other things on its mind. The second hatchling, the curious one, stretched its neck forward from behind him and sniffed at it too. Then it withdrew. Neither of them ate it. That was fine. The point had not been food. The point had been a gesture, something offered freely in the space between them, with no expectation. Rael's voice came into his ear again. She had been quiet for a while, which he appreciated. The wound hasn't gotten worse on the camera feed, she said, but it hasn't stopped either. if you're going to try the pressure point. You should probably do it soon. I know, he said quietly. Do you want me to talk you through it again? No, I remember. He looked at the injured hatchling. It was looking back at him, the exhaustion in its eyes had not changed, but something else had, something in the angle of its body, the set of its shoulders. It was still hurting, but it was not leaning away from him anymore. It had been when he first sat down, subtly, without drama, over the course of the last however many minutes. It had stopped leaning away. He moved his hand from the floor. He did it slowly, like everything else. He let his hand travel toward the hatchling in a wide, visible arc, not reaching for the wound, not reaching for the head, but angled for the space below its left foreleg, where Rail had directed him. The hatchling watched his hand the whole way. It did not move back. He placed 2 fingers on the spot. The hatchling went very, very still. He held the pressure, firm, steady, not shifting, and counted in his head. The way Rail had told him to. The hatchling's breath changed, something in the set of its body shifted, the tension going out of it in a way that told him the pain was changing, not gone but different. The secondary pressure was doing what it was supposed to do. It lasted less than a minute. Then the hatchling did something he hadn't expected. It put its head down, not all the way to the floor, just down. Neck lowering, skull dipping forward, in the slow, deliberate way of something that has decided to let its guard go, just a little, just enough. He kept the pressure steady and stayed quiet. From somewhere above him, from the observation window where 24 crew members and 1 Vreth elder had been standing in silence for the better part of an hour, he was not able to hear anything. But Elder Drawsk, who had not sat down and had not stepped back from the glass, turned to Dr. Rails' colleague, the station's xenolinguist, a young Orvani named Fess, who had come up to observe, and said something in Vreth that Fess translated 3 seconds later in a whisper. He says, the old one says, that in their tradition, what is happening right now has a name. He says it is called Rikath, first approach, he says. It is the moment before bonding begins. The hatchlings recognize it before the Guardian does. Vess paused. He also says he has never seen it happen with a being who was not Vreth. Down in the bay, Darien didn't know any of that. He knew the hatchlings. Breathing had evened out. He knew the dark spreading beneath it had slowed. He knew that the second hatchling had settled onto the floor behind him. Not touching him, but close, the way a dog settled near a person it had decided was acceptable, and he knew without looking that there were others nearby. He could feel them the way you feel weather, not seeing it yet, but knowing it's coming. He stayed where he was. He kept the pressure going. He talked low and even, not for meaning, but for sound. He told the hatchling about the fuel line he had fixed that morning. He told it about the cargo loader and the crack in the seal, and how that particular model always cracked in the same place because of a manufacturing flaw that the company had never bothered to address. He told it that the repair was clean and the loader was fine, and that some things just needed someone to sit with them long enough to figure out what they actually needed. The hatchling's eyes drifted closed. Not all the way. Vreth, he would later learn, never fully closed their eyes when they slept in unfamiliar places, but they were mostly closed, and the breathing under his fingers was slow and regular, and the weight of the small, scaled body had shifted just slightly so that it was leaning in the smallest possible way against his knee. He looked down at it for a moment. Then he looked up at the observation window. He couldn't see anyone clearly. The light was wrong, but he could see the shapes of them, and he could see that none of them had moved. He clicked the comm open, Commander Brell. A pause, Then her voice, and it had something in it he hadn't heard from her before, a kind of careful steadiness, like she was holding something. Fragile Cole. I need a med kit, he said. Wound care, breath compatible if we have it. Though I'll work with human spec if that's what's available, and if someone could tell Elder Drawsk that the smallest one is going to be okay, I think he'd want to know. A longer pause. Then from somewhere in the background of the comm, not Brel, not Rail, came a sound that Darien did not immediately recognize as coming from a Vreth. Elder, because he had never heard a Vreth Elder make a sound like that before. Low, rough at the edges, like something very old and very contained finally. Letting go of a breath it had been holding for a long time. He clicked the comm off and looked back down at the hatchling on his knee. You're all right, he told it quietly. You're going to be all right. He wasn't entirely sure which of them he was talking to. The med kit arrived in the hands of Dr. Rail herself. She came through the blast door alone, which Darien suspected had taken some negotiation with Commander Brel, because Brel did not like sending people into uncertain situations without backup, and Rail was not a field operative. She was a xenobiologist with a research posting and a habit of walking toward things that most people walked away from. In that sense, Darien thought she and he had something in common. She moved the way he had moved, carefully, with awareness keeping her body language plain. She had clearly been watching from the observation window. She had seen what approach looked like in that bay, and she replicated it. Now, without being told to, he appreciated that about her. She understood what she was looking at. The hatchling that had been sleeping against his knee raised its head when she entered. It watched her cross the bay. It did not get up. The second hatchling behind Darien shifted but stayed where it was, from above the cargo pallets. The third observed as it had been observing everything. The fourth, the one that had dropped in front of him at the start of all. This was somewhere in the shadows near the parked ships. He could feel its attention even when he couldn't see it. Rail crouched beside him and opened the med kit without speaking. She found the Vreth-compatible wound sealant. They did have it, apparently, which said something about how often this station dealt with Vreth vessels, and began to assess the injured hatchling's flank. The hatchling watched her with the same tired amber eyes it had watched Darien with. It didn't hiss. It didn't move, having apparently decided that the human sitting against it was not a threat. It seemed to have extended that decision cautiously to other humans in the immediate vicinity. Deep but clean, Rail said softly. The scales around it took most of the force. If this had caught soft tissue directly, we'd be in different shape. She worked as she talked, hands quiet and practiced. You held the pressure well. It made a difference. Good, Darien said. They worked in silence for a while after that. Or rather, Rail worked and Darien stayed still, because the most useful thing he could do was exactly that. The hatchlings were balanced on a point, not calm, not dangerous, but somewhere in between, that required the situation to not change too quickly. He was the anchor of the situation. He stayed. When the blast door opened again, it was not medical personnel. Elder Drawsk came through it alone. He walked slowly, and Darien could not tell if that was age or deliberateness, or both. The old Vreth was larger than the rest of his crew, taller, broader across the shoulders, and he carried himself with the kind of stillness that was different from tension. It was the stillness of someone who had learned, over a very long time, to take up exactly the space they needed and no more. He stopped several meters away. He looked at the four hatchlings. He looked at Darien. He was quiet for a long time. Rail glanced at Darien and then went back to her work. Finally, Elder Drawsk crossed the remaining distance and crouched down, not Without effort, his old joints took a moment about it, so that he was at eye level with the injured hatchling. He looked at it for a very long moment. Something passed between them that Darian couldn't interpret and didn't try to. Then Drawsk straightened and looked at Darian directly. "I need to tell you something," the elder said. His standard was careful but fluent. He had clearly spoken it for many years, "and I want you to understand that I am not speaking lightly." Darian waited. "Thousands of years ago," Drawsk began, "when my people first left our world and found that we were not alone in the stars, we encountered a species that recognized what our hatchlings were in the feral window, recognized it and decided to use it. They understood that the feral window was when a hatchling sought a bond when it was most open, most searching. They took our young during that window and they bonded them to warriors, to soldiers. They created weapons from our children." He said the last words quietly, but there was a weight behind them that Darian felt in his chest. "It took us 3 generations to undo what had been done," Drawsk continued. "Those bonded ones, they could never be fully returned to us. The bond had been made, it could not be unmade. We lost them, all of them." He paused. "After that, it became the deepest law of our people. No one who is not Vreth may approach a hatchling in the feral window, not because we believe other species are like the ones who took our children, but because we could not risk being wrong again." Darian said nothing. He wasn't sure there was anything to say. "You approached them," Drawsk said. "You sat beside them, you helped the injured one, and they allowed it, all 4 of them." He looked at Darian steadily. "In the Vreth clutch accord, the law that governs our hatchlings and their bonding, there is a term for what you did. We call it Rikas. First approach, it is what a bonding guardian does. What you did, Darian Cole, has a meaning in our law that is not symbolic." Rael had stopped working. She was listening. "By the accord," Drawsk said, "you are now considered a bonding guardian too. These 4, legally, formally, in every way that our law recognizes." He paused. "I want you to understand what that means before you react to it. It means you are, by Vreth reckoning, their family. The bond is in its early stage. It can still be completed properly at ceremony with the full rites. But the Rikas has been performed. That part cannot be undone." Darian looked at the hatchling leaning against his knee. He looked at the one settled on the floor behind him. He thought about this for a moment. "Does that mean I have to attend a ceremony?" he asked. Something moved in Drawsk's face. It took Darian a second to recognize it, because he had not seen a Vreth make the expression before, but when the elder answered, the thing in his face was unmistakably close to the edge of a smile. "It is 3 days long," Drawsk said. "Right," Darian said. Rael made a sound beside him that she quickly converted into clearing her throat. "I will also tell you," Drawsk continued, and the thing that had been near a smile was gone now, replaced by something more serious and more difficult, "that the injured one, the smallest, is from a clutch that I have been personally escorting to the bonding ceremony, the last survivor of 4 eggs. I have been carrying her across open space for 6 weeks." He looked at her again, at the small amber-scaled shape resting against Darian's knee with her eyes half closed. "I could not approach her myself. I could not help her. I had to stand behind glass and watch." His voice did not change on the last sentence. It stayed level and controlled. But the words themselves carried everything that voice control could not. Darian looked at Drawsk. "She's going to be fine," he said. "The wound is sealed. She's resting." The elder held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, in the way of someone accepting a thing they had been afraid they would not be able to accept. "I know," he said, "because you sat down beside her Later, after the medkit was packed up, after Rail had taken her quiet leave, after Drawsk had returned to the ship with the long walk of a man carrying something lighter than he'd come in, with Darian sat on a cargo crate near the edge of the bay. The four hatchlings had distributed themselves in the space around him in the way of things that had decided a place was acceptable. The injured one was asleep across his lap. He had tried once to shift her onto a folded thermal blanket that someone had passed through the blast door. She had opened one amber eye at him and put her head back down on his leg. He had stopped trying. He drank the cold coffee someone had left with the blanket and looked out. Through the bay window at the stars, they were very still and very far away. And completely indifferent the way stars were, he found that he didn't mind. He was not a man who needed the universe to be paying attention to him. He just needed the next thing to need doing, and then he would do it. On Caro 9, in the docking level, Commander Brell's report was already 12 pages long and growing. In the station communication logs, 17 outgoing signals had been flagged as priority 1 by the automated system, at least. 4 of them were from species governments requesting clarification on what had just occurred and what exactly a human bonding guardian meant under existing interstellar law. Darian didn't know any of that either. He just sat in the dark with 4 alien hatchlings and his cold coffee and watched the stars and thought that the day had turned out stranger than the fuel line had suggested it would. 3 weeks later, the Ashkin Covenant was ready to fly. The hull repairs had taken 12 days, longer than usual because Darian had insisted on redoing 2 sections that a faster worker might have passed. As acceptable, they were not acceptable. They would have held in calm space and failed in turbulence, and the Covenant was heading into a region with unpredictable gravity wells. He had done them properly the way he did everything. Vayek, the first mate, had watched him redo the second section without saying a word, and when he was done, she had made a mark on her personal log that he couldn't read but suspected was complimentary. The hatchlings had stayed in the bay. This had required some negotiation between Commander Brell and Elder Drawsk, and some creative reinterpretation of station regulations around unregistered biological passengers, but it had been resolved because both of them were practical people who understood that telling 4 feral Vreth hatchlings they had to go back into a containment unit was not a conversation that ended well. They had been given the run of Bay 7, which remained partially sealed but no longer under full lockdown. They had adapted to this arrangement with the flexible intelligence of young things, and they had spent 3 weeks learning the geography of the bay and destroying 2 fuel hose covers that had apparently been asking for it. Darian had fixed the covers. He had also, over the course of 3 weeks, fixed a great many other things in Bay 7 while 4 hatchlings watched him, followed him, occasionally climbed on him, and in the case of the injured one whose wound had healed cleanly, whose amber scales had brightened as she recovered, napped on whatever part of him was available and warm. He had learned things about them, that they were curious in a structured way. Not random, they investigated things methodically, working from the edges. That they communicated with each other in a combination of sounds and postures. That he couldn't replicate, but was starting to read a little. That the largest one, dark-scaled and watchful, seemed to have appointed itself to observe Darian specifically, not suspiciously, but with the focused attention of someone taking careful notes. He called them, in his own head, by the names he had made up without meaning to in the first few days. Amber, for the injured one; Watcher, for the large dark one; Curious, for the one who had smelled his hand; Overhead, for the one who had preferred the top of The fuel conduit. He did not tell anyone these names. He wasn't sure why. On the morning the Covenant was cleared for departure, Commander Brell called him into her office. It was a small office, practical, with the organized surface of someone who dealt with an enormous amount of detail by keeping it all visible. She was sitting behind it with a look he recognized, the careful one, the one she used when she was about to give someone information she wasn't sure they wanted. She told him that the story had spread. This was not a surprise. He had been aware in a general way that things had moved beyond the station. People talked, signals traveled, the communication logs had been busy in those first few days. He had not paid particular attention because it had not changed what needed to be done. It's been discussed in at least 3 interstellar council sessions, Brell said. The Thule Collective sent a formal inquiry. The Sethri Accord wants a report. We have had more requests for communication with this station in 3 weeks than in the previous 2 years combined. He considered this about me fixing a ship and sitting on a floor, about a human doing something that no other species has done in recorded contact with the Vreth. She leaned forward slightly. Darian, I'm not sure you fully understand what the Rakath means in terms of. Drawsk explained it, he said. Did he explain that the Vreth homeworld has formally requested your presence at the ceremony, not as a guest, but as a named participant? Did he explain that there are 3 other species delegations who have asked to send observers to the ceremony specifically to observe you? He looked at her. No, he mentioned it was 3 days long. She looked at him for a moment, then she sat back in her chair and made the sound she made when she had decided to stop arguing a point, because the point had stopped being relevant. The Covenant leaves at midday. You have a travel berth on it. That was Drawsk's request and I approved it. The question is whether you want to go. He thought about it for less time than she probably expected. The hull work is done, he said. There's nothing on my board that Uran can't handle. Uran was his second. He was good. Yeah, Darian said. I'll go. Brell nodded. She looked like she had more to say and had decided against it. He was almost at the door when she spoke. For what it's worth, she said, I've been trying to explain to the Thule Inquiry what you did and why you did it. It's harder than I expected. He stopped. What do you mean? They keep asking what your reason was, what your training was, what protocol you were following. She paused. I keep telling them that you saw something hurt and you walked over to it, and they keep sending back responses that indicate they don't find that sufficient as an explanation. He thought about this. What do you tell them? I've started telling them that it's a human thing, she said. That we seem to have a particular, she searched for the word, pull toward the hurt ones, toward the ones that haven't made up their minds about us yet. I don't know if that's accurate as a species generalization, but it is accurate. For the humans, I've known well enough to say. She looked at him steadily. It is accurate for you. He didn't know what to do with that, so he nodded once and went to pack a bag. The docking ramp of the Ashkin Covenant was extended at midday, just as the station's light cycle shifted to its afternoon setting. Darian came through the bay with a single bag over one shoulder. He had packed practically tools he would need, clothes for 3 days of ceremony, a work pad in case something on the ship needed attention during the journey. Vayek met him at the base of the ramp. She looked at him in the way she had looked at him from the beginning, the recalibrating look, the one that was still working something out. Then she nodded and stepped aside. Amber was in an approved transport harness near the cargo loading area. The harness had been designed for large animal transport, and Rail had modified it over the past week to fit a Vreth hatchling, which had involved some creative engineering and a great deal of Amber's patient tolerance for being measured. The other three were loose in the bay, which they were allowed to be until departure. Amber saw Darien. She made the sound, the low throat vibration that had started as something uncertain and had become, over 3 weeks, something that meant recognition. And something more than recognition. He crossed the bay and reached over and scratched behind her neck ridge. The place he had figured out she liked, the spot where the scales were slightly thinner and the touch registered differently. She pressed into his hand the way she always did. Her scales were warm and bright, and her wound was fully healed, and the exhaustion that had been in her amber eyes in that dark corner under the cargo pallet was entirely gone. He picked up the carrying handle of the harness, and they walked together up the ramp. Elder Drawsk was at the top of it. The old Vreth looked at the human walking up the ramp with his granddaughters clutchmate in one hand and a travel bag in the other, and his face did the thing it did when he was holding something that would not stay held. He stepped to the side and let them pass. Then he turned to Vayek, who had come up behind them. He did not think he was doing something extraordinary, Drawsk said. He said it quietly, not quite to himself, but not quite to Vayek either. She watched the human disappear into the corridor beyond. No, she said. That is exactly what made him extraordinary. The ramp retracted, the bay sealed, the Ashkin Covenant disengaged from the clamps with a sound like a held breath releasing, and moved out through the wide doors of Bay 7 into open space. On Caro 9, Commander Brell filed the last section of her report and sent it. In 14 hours, it would reach the Thule Collective's main council hub. In 3 days, it would be translated into 42 languages. In a month, it would be read by beings on stations and ships and worlds that had never heard of Caro 9 or Darien Cole, and it would prompt questions in corners of the galaxy that had never thought to ask them before. The report was long and detailed and carefully worded. But the part that was quoted most widely in the years that followed was a single paragraph near the end that Commander Brell had almost cut because she thought it sounded too personal for a formal document. She had left it in because it was true, and she believed true things deserved to be said. It read, "Of all the things I have observed in my years of commanding a multi-species station, the one I find most consistently remarkable is this. When something is frightened or hurt or alone, and every other species in the room steps back, the human steps forward. They do not always know why. They do not always have a plan. They simply move toward the thing that needs someone to move toward it, and they stay and they wait, and more often than not, they are trusted in return. I have come to believe this is not a behavior, it is a nature, and I am not certain the humans themselves understand how rare it is." In the corridor of the Ashkin Covenant, Darien Cole found his berth and put his bag down and looked out the porthole at Caro 9, getting smaller behind them. He thought about the fuel line he had fixed that morning before all of this started, and how clean the seal had looked, and how that was still the best part of any job, the moment when something broken became whole. Amber was settled in the harness beside his berth, watching him with her amber eyes the way she had watched him from that dark corner 3 weeks ago. He looked back at her. 3 days, he told her. She made the low sound. He sat down and picked up his work pad, because there was always something on the work pad, and some things did not change just because the galaxy had quietly decided to notice you. He scrolled through the maintenance list Uran had forwarded for the journey, found 2 items that seemed like they might need his attention, and got to work. Outside the porthole, The stars were very still and very far away and completely indifferent, the way they always were. He had never needed them to be anything else.